Once upon a time, there was a prophet named Ezekiel. He was chosen by God to deliver important messages to the people of Israel. The people were disobedient, worshiping false gods, and living in ways that angered God. As a result, God was ready to punish them for their sin. Ezekiel's job was to warn them, even if the messages were difficult. One day, Ezekiel received a strange command from God. God told Ezekiel, "Take wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. Put them in a single pot and bake them into bread. But there is one thing you must do that will be a sign to the people. You must cook this bread over human dung." Ezekiel was shocked. He had never heard anything like this before. Cooking bread was something he had done many times, and he knew the process well. He had carefully measured ingredients and followed the rituals of preparing food for his family and others. The scent of fresh baked bread was something he cherished, a comfort in his life. But the idea of using human dung as fuel to cook this bread was beyond anything he could comprehend. The thought of it made his stomach churn. It was a repulsive idea, and he could feel his face pale at the very suggestion. Dung, after all, was something unclean, something to be avoided at all costs. It wasn't just the physical act of using it, it was the spiritual and cultural implications. In Ezekiel's world, human dung was considered impure and unsuitable for anything good or sacred. The very idea of using it to bake bread, food that would sustain him, was disturbing to his core. His mind raced with questions. Was this really God's will? He had followed God's instructions before, but this was different. This was beyond uncomfortable. It was something deeply unsettling. Ezekiel didn't want to disobey God, so he asked, "Lord, I have never defiled myself. How can I cook my food with something so impure?" God's voice replied, "You may use cow dung instead of human dung, but this will still be a sign to the people of Israel." Ezekiel, though still troubled, obeyed God. He gathered all the grains and beans that God had instructed him to use. He carefully mixed them together and prepared the bread. But when it came time to cook the bread, he did something that still made him uncomfortable. He used cow dung to build the fire. As the bread baked, the smell of dung filled the air. It was not only unpleasant, it was deeply offensive. Ezekiel could feel the weight of the task as he watched the bread bake. He knew that this act was not about making food. It was a symbol, a sign from God to the people of Israel. When the bread was ready, Ezekiel picked it up and went to the people. He was nervous about how they would react, knowing that they would see his actions as strange and disgusting. But God had a plan. Ezekiel wasn't just baking bread, he was delivering a message, and the people needed to hear it. As Ezekiel walked through the town, people stared at him. They whispered to each other, pointing at the strange bread he was carrying. They must have wondered why Ezekiel had baked bread in such an unusual way. Some may have been curious, while others might have been disgusted. But Ezekiel knew that this was exactly what God wanted him to do. He reached a place where he could speak to the people, and with the bread in his hands, Ezekiel explained, "This bread, baked over dung, is a sign from God. Just as the bread has been defiled, so have the people of Israel. Your sin has made you unclean, and if you do not repent, you will face the consequences." Ezekiel continued, explaining that just as the bread was cooked over a defiled fire, the people of Israel had defiled themselves through their disobedience. Their lives were filled with sin, and every aspect of their behavior reflected their rebellion against God's commands. They had been consumed by lust, indulging in immoral acts and chasing after fleeting pleasures that only led them farther away from righteousness. Instead of following God's commandments and living in purity, they had chosen to worship false gods, idols that they crafted with their own hands, giving their hearts to these lifeless objects of worship. The people of Israel had abandoned the holiness that was expected of them, and in its place, they embraced excess, greed, and self-indulgence. Their lust for power and possessions had taken over, and they sought to satisfy their every craving without regard for others or for God's will. The people had fallen into the trap of gluttony, constantly chasing more food, more wealth, more luxuries, and more pleasures, without ever being satisfied. The people listened, but many didn't understand. They saw the strange bread and the terrible symbol, but they didn't realize the depth of what Ezekiel was saying. They were still blind to the seriousness of their sin. They had grown comfortable in their disobedience, and the shock of the bread only lasted for a moment. But Ezekiel wasn't finished yet. He had to make sure the people truly understood what would happen if they did not repent. Just as this bread was baked over dung, so will the lives of the people of Israel be defiled. Ezekiel continued, "Your cities will be destroyed, and your lives will be hard. If you do not turn back to God, you will face a terrible judgment." Ezekiel's message was hard to hear, but it was clear. The people needed to change their ways, or they would face destruction. God's mercy was still available, but only if they repented and turned back to Him. Days passed, and many people mocked Ezekiel's message. They didn't take him seriously. They didn't want to hear about the consequences of their actions. The bread, though shocking, didn't seem to have the effect God intended. The people of Israel continued in their sin, ignoring God's warning, and then the worst came. Just as Ezekiel had warned, the city of Jerusalem was besieged by the Babylonians. The mighty army of King Nebuchadnezzar surrounded the city, cutting off food and water. The people were trapped, and their city was slowly being destroyed. Those who didn't die in the battle were taken into exile, carried off to a foreign land. Ezekiel's message had come true. The people of Israel had not repented, and their disobedience had led them to disaster. But even in the middle of this destruction, God had not abandoned His people. Ezekiel's task wasn't just to deliver bad news, it was to offer hope as well. Even though the people were facing punishment, God promised that He would bring them back one day. He would restore them to their land, and He would change their hearts. Ezekiel's obedience to God's strange command was a powerful lesson. He didn't understand why God asked him to bake bread over dung, but he obeyed. Through this simple act, God showed the people of Israel the depth of their sin and the seriousness of their disobedience. The bread was a powerful symbol that helped the people see that their actions had made them unclean. Ezekiel's task was difficult, but he trusted God, even when the message didn't make sense. His obedience teaches us that sometimes we are called to do hard things, even when we don't understand the reason behind them. God's ways are higher than our ways, and He often uses difficult situations to teach us important lessons.